Thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm Duncan Faraday, the Director of American Studies here at the Graduate Center. And on behalf of the Graduate Center, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Khalil Mohammed, the Director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, here this afternoon. And really to thank him for joining us for what promises to be an engaging conversation about both his own scholarly work and the work of the Schomburg. So welcome to Khalil.
Thank you.
Before I briefly introduce our speakers, I want to extend my thanks, particularly because he's in the room today, to President Bill Kelly for his support in making this event and all the events that American Studies sponsors possible. Without Bill's support, even down to letting us imagine that this very room is an extension of American Studies, none of the work that the program does or that Revolutionizing American Studies undertakes would exist. So thank you, Bill. Thanks as well to Louise Lenahan and Don Robotham for their tireless support of any endeavor which creates opportunities for our students. And double thanks to Sandy Robinson for her patience and continued support. I want to especially thank Joan Harden for her invaluable logistical help, and to note with some pleasure that one of the delights in putting this event together was to discover her long-standing connection to the Schomburg. She directed special events at the Schomburg, in addition to working here for...
Where is she?
You'll meet her later.
Oh, great. I have questions for her.
But Joan worked both at the Graduate Center and the Schomburg for several decades. Thanks as well to Candace Chu, Herman Bennett, and Robert Reid-Pharr for their help with this and other projects. Our format this afternoon is intended to be conversational, so I won't say much before I turn things over to Robert. Robert, as I'm sure you're all aware, is a distinguished professor of English and American Studies here at the Graduate Center, and he's very kindly agreed to be our MC this afternoon. Khalil Mohammed is, as I mentioned, the director of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. He received his PhD in American History from Rutgers in 2004. After completing his degree, he spent 2 years as a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the Vera Institute of Justice, a nonprofit criminal justice reform agency in New York City, before joining the faculty of the History Department at Indiana University. Dr. Mohammed left Indiana in 2010 for his position at the Schomburg. He's the author of The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America, which was the 2011 winner of the John Hope Franklin Prize from the American Studies Association. He is currently at work on a new project entitled, I think, Disappearing Acts, The End of White Criminality in the Age of Jim Crow. Please join me in welcoming Khalil to the Graduate Center.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Duncan.
Thank you, Duncan. So I thought that the way that we would proceed is that I'll talk to Khalil a little bit about his background, and I specifically would like to know a little bit about the project that you're working on. And then I have a few questions I wanted to ask you just about the direction of the Schomburg and where you see it going. And then at the end, we were hoping that we would give you an opportunity would give him an opportunity to talk about the things that he wanted to talk about, and also give everyone in the room a chance to ask engaging questions. I also just want to take an opportunity to say that I think I speak for everyone to say that when it was announced that you were going to come to the Schomburg in 2010, in all of the newspapers, and that we were very, very excited about it, and I personally think that it was an incredible move on the part of the library to bring you. So welcome, and also I hope that this is not the last time that you're going to be at the Graduate Center. One of the things that many people in this room, and everyone in this room, frankly, I would say, and I think most people in this building want is a closer relationship with the Schomburg. Every person here has spent time in it, and every person here values it a great deal. So you should feel that you're at home.
Good, I do. Let me just let me say thank you very much for having me. I have a cold, so that's why the voice is what it is, but it has not diminished my spirit or my desire to be here, so thank you for coming and being patient. I also want to ask, who are the folks in the room? Just so, not so much a one-by-one introduction, but are they graduate students? Is it a class? Is it American Studies? Is it all sorts of, just so I know who I'm talking to?
Well, the answer to that is yes, yes, yes. And the bunch of the students are in fact students who are in the English program, I should say. Mm-hmm. We have an American Studies program here as well, and a bunch of the students in the room are students in the American Studies program, and they're students from a variety of disciplines in this room. There are also faculty members. I like it that you can't tell the faculty members from the graduate
I
student.
think that's great.
You know that Bill is here, and people filming us as well are here, and so those are the folks. I think it's a pretty reasonable cross section of the GC community.
Okay,
Can I
great.
quickly add, we have some prospective students here too. Welcome, prospective students. Delighted to have you.
And I'm sorry, I think that the librarian is here.
You're wonderful. Thank you.
All right, any other community, I'm sorry, any other communities that I need to name before we go forward to be inclusive about it? Then speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay.
Okay, great.
Can you actually talk a little bit about the new project, the Disappearing Acts?
Sure. So the project looks at what I see as a moment, a rupture in the sort of cultural signifiers of criminality. So to the extent that crime wears racial identities in this country, it shifts and evolves by region, by time, by place. And much of the work, the historiographical traditions that I have written in and studied, which were sort of traditional African-American intellectual history, early 20th century, the big divide in the historiography is between blacks and their criminal justice experiences and the stigma of criminality in the South, and a kind of polyglot white ethnic community of first, second generation newcomers to places like New York and the North. And at some point in the early 20th century, the notion of criminality shifts from a very plural one, which is foreign, which is mostly white but can be Asian, particularly on the West Coast, but certainly even in a place like New York. And although blacks are part of the equation, both Caribbean, Southern born, they're so limited geographically to very specific sites of the city that most of the sort of cultural matrix that defines criminality in the city is mostly a white one. And for me, it's counterintuitive to the very dominant narratives of race, which is code for black, right? Because we all know, we're all sophisticated thinkers and scholars here, that race does not tell us who we're talking about. But that most of our colloquial and even scholarly understandings of race are proxies for blackness. But the truth is that there is a moment where kind of the infrastructure, the material reality of how criminals are made in this country shifts dramatically towards black and brown faces in the post-World War II period. And it's not really a story that's been told at all, because so much of the historiography has two divides. One is Southern, so post-slavery, 1865 to 1965, so it's a very Southern linear story about criminal justice abuses. And Douglas Blackman's work, for those who, this may not be your subject area, but won a Pulitzer Prize in 2009 called Slavery by Another Name. It's been on PBS the last couple of years. That sort of tells in a very dramatic, rich, documentary way that story. And as much as it still needs to be told, and as much as it is still relevant, particularly in the context of mass incarceration today, it's for historians and for scholars, it's a pretty old story. It reinforces, though, unfortunately, this bifurcation between race and crime, or racism and criminal justice, as a Southern story in the past, and our contemporary realities, which are much more complicated, right? Which are not about racism. They may still be about race, but it's really about the disproportionate offending of the racial groups. And what are we to do but keep a close eye on them?
Right.
So various policies of surveillance, like stop and frisk, see themselves as denuded of this racist past, which they imagine, and the they here is Bloomberg and Ray Kelly, and we fill in a whole bunch of other folks, some of whom work for the CUNY system. Bill, I know you're okay with this. So, when they think about racism, they're taking their mind's eye to a distant time and place.
Yeah.
So what Disappearing Acts is, it does a kind of reset on a kind of old tradition of social control literature that looked at white ethnic groups and the ways in which juvenile justice administrators and corrections facilities and early forms of inter-ethnic policing Irish cops beating on old Americans beating on Irish citizens or newcomers to the state. That's pretty old historiography, and not a lot is being generated from that work. It was happening in the 70s and 80s, a little into the 90s. A woman named Rebecca McLennan wrote a big book from Cambridge a couple of years ago called The Prison and the Gallows. I think that's the name of it. Or am I mixing it? Does anyone know Rebecca McLennan's work? Okay, I don't want to get too specialist focused here. So not a lot of generative work happening in that field. But you're left with this historical memory that, Broadway Empire, what is it, The Godfather, this sort of mind's eye takes us to a distant time and place when white people were sort of caught up in underground economies and shooting at each other in the streets. But we see no political economy with that system in relationship to our current one. There's a complete and utter disconnect between what actually happened in that moment and our telling of those stories in relation to black people as they move in the post-World War II period. So Disappearing Acts, for lack of any more specificity, essentially makes a central claim that the Prohibition era produces a set of criminal justice policies and practices that we could liken to the first era of mass incarceration. Because by changing the laws to a series of mandatory minimum sentencing mandates, a four strikes law, which goes on the book in New York, it's modeled in 33 other states, including Indiana at the time, essentially is the predicate for more and more people going to prison for much longer periods of time, which is exactly the recipe for mass incarceration today. Even if you hold crime constant, if you put more people in prison for the same behavior rather than diverting them to probation or parole or some other means, and you make them stay there much longer, your prison population just balloons. So this is a moment where that could have happened. And the fact that it was bound up in this larger discourse of a moral crisis about alcohol and its destructive tendencies on the moral fiber of America, and particularly because immigrants, this was like, they wore the stigma of carrying this cultural practice, which of course was baloney. But I mean, there's something to be said for Italians brewing wine in their bathtubs, but the appetite for alcohol was widely shared. So the fact that you created this gigantic underground economy, and then you have these tough on crime advocates who essentially see this as the appropriate way to deal with it. So the law passes in 1921. By 1926, New York is innovating these four strikes laws. Prisons are ballooning. There's riots taking place. You have jury nullification. You have judges that are apologizing to defendants. But it's fascinating, and I'll finish on this point because I could go on. By the time Al Smith steps down and Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes governor of New York, he's sitting on top of this growing problem of the over-incarceration of white ethnic men for basically a moral vice issue. And the relationship between the rationale for the law, which is that these are bad people who should be incapacitated because they've proven time and time again not to be reformable, breaks down in the wake of the facts that most of them are nonviolent property offenders who have nothing to do with bootlegging. I.e. small-time petty drug users today who are being sentenced for drug trafficking under mandatory minimum laws in this state and elsewhere. So the argument in Disappearing Acts is essentially that people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt begin to see this as a structural problem. And in the language of our sequestration moment, you get this, and I'm paraphrasing here, this sort of language of these communities are too big to jail. Like, we need these people. They're the future. And they backpedal on everything, including the four strikes laws. Of course, prohibition is repealed. And I'm arguing that it's at that moment in the 1930s, which precedes the New Deal, but in New York is already sort of innovating these big solutions, right? And even in the Prohibition period is a big solution, it's a big federal solution to local problems. The New Deal itself encapsulates this moment, and we know it as the kind of infrastructure of a social welfare system, which is a carryover from the progressive era, but it has huge unacknowledged benefits to people who were previously stigmatized as criminals and incarcerated for very long sentences. And so essentially they become victims of a carceral state.
Yeah.
And everybody backpedals. So they disappear. So the acts themselves disappear. The actual legal infrastructure of these laws that had put these people away for long periods of time come off the books. And then the face of this white ethnic criminal begins to recede from the popular press, from the popular mind's eye, and ultimately becomes a kind of story that is told of this once upon a time, to borrow from a very famous gangster film of the 1980s, and enter the problematic black and brown jazz, heroin, marijuana smoking agents of destruction in our society. And there's complete historical amnesia about this other era. And that's the generous reading of it. Of course, the more cynical one is, of course, that race becomes the factor that distinguishes this new criminal menace and vector of moral decay in society, the black and brown person in these cities, which is distinctive from the white ethnic face, which has been whitewashed by the New Deal and made assimilable and acceptable to society.
Really fascinating. Can I just ask really quickly if you can talk maybe a second about the archives that you're using to do this? I mean, are there specific places that you're going for this?
Yeah, sure. So I've always, I had no idea that I'd ever be responsible for an archive. So I'd just be honest with you. Even taking care of books, I mean, I had like 300 books in my office at Indiana University, and my librarians are like the most protective preservationists in the world. You know, they don't want anybody to have any books longer. You know, you all participate in Marley, for example, so you technically have borrowing privileges from NYPL, and it just drives them up a wall. So I'm admitting that I'm more like you than I am representing the archival community.
We'll keep it on the low.
Keep it on the
That's
low.
fine.
That being said, I've always taken the approach, because I work in an area that has been neglected by repositories of the humanities, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I've always taken a very wide net approach to finding sources that would be useful to me. Mm-hmm. And in the first project, Condemnation, I found that the most likely sources that I could tell that story would be found in social service organizations, even though that wasn't the plan initially. But I found that the closer and closer I got to the target audience, where sort of the infrastructure of crime prevention and control was working, even on the margins of social service agencies, I could find nuggets in annual reports of organizations. And it turned out to be very fruitful. In this project, because I'm also trying to tell a more formal criminal justice story, I'm actually going to a more state-produced archive. So I started literally a month before I got a call, and this is just biographical, but a month before I got a call saying, "Are you interested in becoming the next director of the Schomburg?" To which you, even if you're not, your only answer is yes. So if that happens to any of you at some point, you say yes. I just hadn't given it any thought, but you pick up a phone, someone asks you such a question, you just say yes until you change your mind. So. But the point is that about a month before, I had been sitting in the municipal archives across from the Tweed Courthouse, working on essentially a wide net approach to finding any evidence of how this city was responding to the changing demographics of black and brown residents. And there was a lot of good stuff in the LaGuardia papers. And I know one of Andrew Battle. Does anyone know Andrew Battle? Yeah, so Andrew, who was my publicist at Harvard, before he left for graduate school, is now doing a lot of work on LaGuardia's papers. So that's, so I somewhat traditional, go to a mayor's papers who has had these flashpoints around these issues. So there's a Harlem riot in 1935, he commissions the report, E. Franklin Frazier authors it. So I knew there was a there, and I looked for it. But, I'm looking very widely at all sorts of city records. I'll give one last anecdote. There's records around the city in the municipal archives, for example, of residents, and Andrew has found this too because he's using those same records, of residents complaining to various precinct captains about rowdy behavior on playgrounds of black newcomers. And you can read them literally as reporting the facts, or you can read them as expressing this anxiety about having to share public space with people who they deem unworthy of sharing that public space. So it's, those are things that it's very hard to see in a finding aid. And so since I know I have a lot of English people here, and I am, as Herman is, very much trained as a disciplined historian, the archive, there are no shortcuts in the archives. And one of the things that my curators of our archive division, and by the way, I brought this with me so you can see how long the collection list is, organized by subject headings. I just encourage all of you to go download the website and to spend some time with it. They have said to me repeatedly that we don't get enough people who are literary scholars who have the patience or the interest in really working with the archives. And they see it as a shame because they hear of these projects. You know, they tap into people who sort of come with a passing interest, may inquire about a writer or some context, and then they show up and they're like, no, you know, I didn't see anything, thank you. And our archivists are like, I know there's tons of stuff there that would be useful to them. So there's a kind of impatience with it because you really are reading, in some cases, between the lines, but you have to make connections that are contextual as much or circumstantial as much as they are direct line to whatever writer or set of theoretical themes that you're engaged in. So that's, you know, for me, that's been the only way that I could attack these issues in the broadest scholarly way through the archives, because there just aren't good criminal justice. Right. Crime is by definition a contemporary issue of the times. It is a crisis moment. It is the here and the now, and there's very little patience for the audience for sort of, well, why would that matter? Because people are dying on the streets right now. Mm-hmm. And the archives reflect that in many ways.
I think that that's probably a good segue for us to talk about a little bit about my real question I want to ask you, but you don't have to answer this question, but just keep it in the back of your mind.
You're just thinking this guy takes too long to answer
questions. No,
so
I'm not thinking anything like that.
What I really want to ask him. Okay.
What I really want to ask is, what is it like to suddenly be the director of the Schomburg after having been a university professor? How is it to actually make that professional transition? But that's a little bit out of school to ask that question like that. But if you want to answer it, go.
Sure. It's you know, it's no different than any one of you who may one day choose to do administration on a university campus, in my opinion. I mean, when I was selling myself for this job, mm-hmm. I was using the analogy of, well, this would like be being a dean or a provost, you know, a little bit more than a chair, because the scope of the operation has really no borders. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the Schomburg could be a satellite campus or center of any university. And in fact, it functions as that to all universities in some very symbolic way, particularly as they produce scholars and graduate students who need its resources. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that made sense. The difference is, of course, that people who become deans and provosts usually have given up the ghost of academic scholarship, or have had some prior administrative experience. Mm-hmm. So I was literally ripped from the classroom and thrown into this situation. And I was foolish enough, or brave or courageous, I'm not sure which it is, to do it. I knew I needed to get out of Bloomington, Indiana. And I had, of course, left New York. Who said that?
There's a Bloomington resident here. It's okay.
It's okay.
Well, Bill was only clapping because he went.
It's okay.
Is she native Bloomington or living there now?
I went to college in Bloomington.
Oh, you got out. You got out. It's okay.
Because the truth is, it's a terrific place. If any of you ever get a job offer there, George Hutchinson was there. Don Belton, who died a couple of years ago, was a wonderful writer, was there. I mean, it is a terrific place to work. But if you have certain needs, it's, you know, you won't necessarily last long. Mm-hmm. So the confluence of the Schomburg I took this opportunity from this vantage point. I said, I've just published my first book. I've just gotten tenure. You know, I have a new project, which I said I was sitting in the city archives a month before I got a call working mm-hmm. on. I was at John Jay doing work on it. I have to be in New York anyway, right? I mean, I was, you know, sort of optimistic enough to think, and I had a long list of Schomburg stuff that I was expecting to look through, and I applied for the Schomburg Scholars in Residence program to come here on a year-long fellowship to do work anyway. Of course, I didn't get it. And so if any of you ever apply to that program and you don't get it, don't take it personally, because neither did I. Or maybe I did, but now I'm the boss, so, well, anyway. I had a lot of apprehension about what the work would be like, and I was naive enough to not know how difficult some of the administrative challenges of running an underfunded research library is in a gigantic system like the New York Public Library. And so, I'm living that daily. And I guess at the end of the day, I felt like the Schomburg is such a special place, and they're catching me at a particular moment in my path that I'm okay with this.
Right.
And, I will make the most of it, and I'll do what I can to move Schomburg along to where I think it should be at this point in its trajectory, and bring with me a lot of friends and peers and advisors and folks who I know care that much about the institution and would want to trust that I would take care of it.
Thank you. And, I'll ask you just one more question before I open it up to the rest of the people in the room. And so you arrive, you've escaped Bloomington, and you arrive in New York City. You have a fantastic, beautiful place that you purchased or rented, and you're living in the city.
None of that's true. I live in New Jersey.
In New Jersey. In New Jersey.
My wife works in Basking Ridge, and if anyone knows New Jersey, she goes in the opposite direction of the city, and I come east. So we live in the middle.
In New Jersey.
Yeah.
So what are the things in terms
South Orange, by the way, so are you.
what are
Not
the
that bad.
what are the challenges that you faced what are the main challenges that you faced when you walked in the front door?
Wow. Is the camera rolling? Well, I inherited an institution that engendered very strong and passionate feelings amongst its custodians and its stakeholders, which means that everyone has very strong feelings about what it should be, who should be running it, what's gone wrong, what's working and doesn't need to be changed. And the leadership of the institution has 3 decades of institutional memory about what that institution stands for. So my predecessor had been there for 27 years. The head of the archives division, she's retiring in about 6 weeks. She's been there for 30 plus years. Her counterpart in the photo and prints division has worked for the New York Public Library for like 38 years. And so you come in essentially the same age as the people who've worked there in years.
Yeah.
And that is not easy to do. Aside from the fact that my strongest cohort of patrons are mostly retirees who, most of whom who grew up in Harlem or came of age in Harlem, have depended upon the Schomburg as part of their cultural life and have grown accustomed to the Schomburg being their institution and the way in which it presented its programming and itself to them. And so when I began to change things even online ticketing, sparks were flying because people were saying, I don't have a computer, and now I show up and I can't even get in. I used to come to events and I could always have a seat. I didn't need to use a computer. Now I don't have a computer, and even when I do get a ticket, it's first come, first serve for most free things. People are like, that's not fair. And so all of a sudden, I'm literally on the front lines of the institution. There's no stage door. There is a stage door, but I don't use it. It's impractical to use, which is to say I function in that space a little bit like either a pastor or a politician because people will let me know what they like or don't like, and they will expect to talk to me as I pass through the lobby on the way to my office, no matter what is on my agenda. And it's like, and it's very difficult to say I can't talk to you right now, or give them the old, passing hi. My predecessor had a little bit of a reputation for not being terribly engaging. I guess I'm more sympathetic to it than I was when I first got there. It's not my way, so I will do the best that I can to manage the urgency of whatever it is I need to be doing at that moment against the need to connect with people. But that's something that took a lot of time and energy. I had an open door policy the first year, and there was like 10 years worth of meetings that planned for me my first year. So it's very hard to get any work done, just meeting after meeting. And I met some really terrific people. I met some crazy people too, who had really, insane ideas about how they could raise money for me, which of course was not really the case. But you learn, and yeah. So that was the biggest challenge. Now I've had second-year challenges that have to do with budget, have to do with the lack of curators, has to do with instituting, sort of cultural change within the institution about tone and public service, sort of battles about fundraising, and sort of how do you position the Schomburg to raise money that doesn't impinge on the library's larger portfolio. These are sort of year 2 issues, because I didn't even know that they were issues until I stuck around long enough to figure out who does that, and they were like, oh, that person left 10 years ago. I said, really? Well, how does that work get done? It doesn't. So, that's where I am now.
I was really struck by your saying that that the librarians are very interested in having more people who are doing work in literature. We are interested in the archive and English departments, I should say, come and participate in and use the facilities that are there, use the collections that are there. I know that one of the things that we have here today are a lot of people who actually are using the Schomburg and who I think have probably their own questions about the things that are most interesting to them. So I think it's a good opportunity
I think
for us
so
to
too. And this
open
helps.
the door.
If you want to yell about them to be more patient, feel free.
What's that?
If you want to yell about them at them to be more patient, feel free to.
Oh, I think, yes. You can't help but be patient at the Schomburg. But this would be very helpful to me, so don't hold back. I mean, I don't have as many opportunities as I'd like to have this kind of open forum for conversation about it. And I met Herman when I was at Rutgers. I was a graduate student. Herman was a new faculty member there, and so I've known him a long time. But
So olden times.
Olden times.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess I would want him to talk about his experiences there too, either to encourage those who have not had their own look at the archive, but also to talk frankly about sort of what works and what doesn't work. So, floor is open. Yes.
Hi, my name is Barbara Webb, and I'm in literature. I teach African and African diaspora literature, and my research is mostly in Caribbean literature. And I have used the Schomburg in the past, but not recently. And I just wanted to know what you were talking about, some new ideas that you had for the Schomburg, and I just wanted to hear some of the things that you were talking about, what you have in, what you're projecting as possibilities, and then how that would relate to people who are interested in literary research and using archives for that.
I think the single theme that would capture the sort of substance of what I see changing at the Schomburg is far more ownership among the staff of public engagement, of being really committed to reaching out to people and not taking this position that this is a precious jewel and you must come to it. And if you don't have the good sense to come to it, then we're not interested in you. That's maybe articulating too strongly a position that people may not consciously be engaged in. But I want to self-correct either way and say all of the leadership at the Schomburg, across all the divisions of the library, under my vision, have a responsibility to do as much outreach as possible to let people know what they're missing and to invite them into that space to engage. And this does happen at some level, but not enough, and it's idiosyncratic, and there are people who are a little uncomfortable with it, and they'll do it because I say so and not because they want to do it. And I'd say that is kind of the single interest. So one thing, for example, is, I've green-lighted. Essentially, I've taken the strengths of the institution that echo this point and invested in it, said, if there are things that you wanted to do here that are more in line with reaching out to many different publics, both academic and community-based, both artistic and writerly, then talk to me. And so we launched a book series tied to our Black, gay, and lesbian archive called Ordinary People. And I brought a few flyers from that anyone is interested. There's events scheduled through June. We do film screenings, but that's not something that was happening there. And it's really the force behind it is the archivist Stephen Fullwood, who is the curator of that particular archive. And I wanted him to have the freedom and the ability to reach out. So that's just one. It's not rocket science, right? At the end of the day, it's a program series. But it's a way of putting us in a position to reach out to a community of interested people, some of whom are scholars, some of whom are activists, artists, whatever, who now know they have a place at the Schomburg, and it's tied back to our archive. So some of them know now of the archive and will use that archive, and that's exactly what I want. Another manifestation of this is I have a new Scholars in Residence director, Farrah Griffin, who is professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. And I chose Farrah not because she's not brilliant, or not just because she's brilliant, and very committed to her students and building intellectual community, but precisely because I knew she would embrace an openness in the space. Not to say her predecessor wasn't open, but different. His name was Colin Palmer. He was there for a long time. He's one of the leading scholars of Caribbean history. And I wanted someone who would bring a very big network into the space and be open to all sorts of conversations happening there. But more than that, I also want the scholars to contribute to the life of the institution by either reaching out to me and saying, hey, I'm working on something that I think the larger Schomburg community would want to know about. Or I want to talk about something in the archive I found that I can't really deal with, but I think we could do an event that the public could engage in. Just be far more, as you all know, scholars are very selfish with their time, with their interest. I mean, they share with their students, but it's part of the job. So, that for me personally, there is a kind of need, and maybe even a growing need, because I've spent a lot of time with many different kinds of publics. And I think the learning curve in public spaces is flattening, and the learning curve in higher education is steepening, which means we're getting smarter faster, and they are getting less smart slower, or a little bit smarter slower. And that's a problem to me. And I see that the Schomburg has an opportunity to help change that by deploying these really smart people and saying, take some responsibility for the public sphere, for what's happening in the public realm. And I know CUNY occupies a space that is by definition more public than the private elite colleges and universities that exist in and around New York, but there's still more work to do. Universities don't necessarily incentivize us. Our citizenship, our service is to the university. Some people do community or service learning credits with their students and that sort of thing, which are institutionalized in many places. So, and it's not an all bad situation.
Khalil, do you have specific or not so specific ways in which, in terms of that, you're wanting the Schomburg to be a bit more publicly engaged, that you think connections could be made both to the City University of New York more generally and specifically to the Graduate Center? Are there things that you would like to see us doing together?
Well, that's a perfect segue to something I've distributed to all of you. So this is grows out of, and Bill, actually, we talked about this. This is something that we talked about over a lunch. But essentially, I was committed to precisely creating a space where smart people doing interesting research could come into a venue that was really very open. And it would consist of, on one hand, graduate students and peer faculty, on another hand, activists who, in this case, it's a very presentist story of Black freedom studies, but the point being that you have people who have strong feelings about how to interpret these paths, whether they live them or whether they're students of them. And I wanted to experience the kind of seminar feeling in a very public way, in a very public realm. And so we started this conversation series. So to me, this is a manifestation of that. Jean Theo-Harris is part of the CUNY family. I don't know that she teaches in the Graduate Center, but she's at Brooklyn College. And she's committed to this kind of work, and she's co-curating it with Kamosi Woodard, who's a leading scholar of Amiri Baraka and other black arts writers. So that's exactly the kinds of relationships that I want to build with academics who say, I'm going to give back to the public sphere. I'm going to help the Schomburg create more space. And I think it's just really exciting for scholars. I'll tell you, we tried to do the first one around Rosa Parks' centennial, which was more traditional, but it was the kickoff to announce the series. Sandy ruined that, so it's going to be rescheduled. Stay tuned. But the first one was just this past week. And what I see all the time is academics presenting for academic audiences, be they graduate students, faculty, or the general academic community, and they're really cool with like 50 people showing up. You know, and they get their
50 people.
I know, right? Scales
I'm cool with 50 people.
20 people. And what you quickly find is when you move into the space of the Schomburg, that scale matters. It matters to me because I've got limited resources and a limited budget. It matters to me because the more people who get exposed to what we do, right, I think makes the world a better place at some very fundamental level. And everyone's not going to be in college. And even your college students don't pay attention to what you're teaching them. So if you get a self-selected audience of people in the public who want to be there, it's a really terrific opportunity. So what happened last week was these 3 scholars of Black Panther Party from Oakland to Chicago came, and they were blown away by the audience. This guy, Jacoby Williams, who's I think leaving the University of Kentucky, who's from Chicago, he's a native Chicagoan. He's like, I can't tell you all how good it feels to be in Harlem, to be speaking to a room full of black and brown and a smattering of white faces, right, of folks who care about these issues. And there were like 70 people with folks standing out in the hallway, because we used our small American Negro Theater because it cost me more money to use the auditorium, so we didn't know what the turnout was going to be. So if all of you all show up and bring your students with you, then we'll just take it to the auditorium. Bill will throw me a few bucks, and we'll be able to make it happen. But you know, that's how I see, at least in the beginning, these relationships work. One last point to your question. NYU, through a program led by Jackie Goldsby and the Mellon Foundation, did this project called the Hidden Archives, which funded graduate students, mostly in the English department, to come to the Schomburg to help process collections using their own intellectual curiosities as a filter for what material was there and helping to expose that material through their own sort of fresh lenses. And that program has been very successful. We still get NYU students every year. Don't know how long it will last, but there's no reason why we can't do something like that with American Studies and English students. They're paid by their institutions, and we make space for them and schedule them and put them to work. And so you're finding things in the archives that can then pay dividends to your own research and to your own careers.
I want to thank you for coming. Really great to have you here. My name is Amiel Alcalay. I'm in the English program, and I initiated something here with some other people called Lost and Found, which is a archival project that we publish a series of chapbooks every year of archival research that our grad students do. And the model is very different. It's collaborative. There's a lot of collaborative work, and we do a lot of work in Schomburg and are increasingly doing more. So it's very exciting to have this connection. The question I wanted to ask you has more to do with, I know this may sound insane, but there's enough at the Schomburg for lifetimes of hundreds of people to work at, but how are your acquisition structures based? I'm curious, how do you think about things? Because one of the things that we had originally thought when we started Lost and Found was think about models for people facing the issue. What do you do with this material? How do things
You
get
mean
done?
as donors or
As
collectors?
donors or collectors,
Mhm.
families, heirs, what are the legalities, what are the structures?
Right.
How do things operate? And we've thought about doing workshops.
It's a wonderful question, and I like to say in my, public rhetoric voice that there's a wealth gap that we're all familiar with, and there's a preservation gap. And so the people represented, who are underrepresented in the archives, whose voices are not there, won't get there without some attempt to close that preservation gap. And your effort is part of a larger effort that's happening probably on too small a scale by a lot of different people who are concerned about the preservation gap. There's just not a lot of good money to support this kind of knowledge building and intervention work. And it reinforces, of course, the cycle, which is to say the collecting institutions who are working with wealthy donors and collectors who know how to bequeath and give their material away will continue to have that advantage over and beyond the other institutions that are less well endowed or whose patrons and subjects are underrepresented. There's really no magic bullet there either, except that we live in a time of retrenchment and austerity in the humanities, and so it's pretty sad actually. I have called for support from Mellon Foundation to launch a focus on this issue, and essentially to bring together all of the collecting institutions that do work around Africana, in the broadest sense, to essentially, one, document the challenges that we all face around this preservation issue, to talk about ways that some of us have been successful overcoming it, and then to give us all the kind of arguments and evidence that we need to make our cases locally for putting an end to it or to changing that reality. And so I'm working on that grant right now. It's likely to be funded. They're asking me for a whole bunch of T's and dotted I's, so we'll get there. But I'm completely with you. And Schomburg we just don't have enough staff. I would love to be a national voice for that, and that's partly what this symposium and conference is attempting to do. But locally, it's hard for me to do it when I am a skeletal staff trading off on public service, on processing, advocacy, genealogy workshops. You can only squeeze so much blood out of your employees, which is, of course, part of the problem.
The question's actually a good follow-up because it's resource-based. In the context, I'm also a library dean, so as much as I understand it,
You
I
are the
wanna
coolest
understand
looking
better.
library dean I've ever met. This only in New York.
I took this trip once, it was like a pilgrimage to go to see the birthplace of Motown and the Motown archives.
Yep, in
When I
Detroit.
got there, I was devastated because it was like a trash garage, and I thought, how could this country let a national archive like this be in such deteriorated condition? I've been going to Schomburg since I was a little girl, and the good news is that wear and tear has shown its way. But the bad news is I don't know where NYPL is in terms of the priority of your institution from a facilities standpoint. And we both know that you can't trade off the funding for resources in the name of facilities. But what do you anticipate down the line and what's already in the works? Because the facilities have a screaming need and I want to support it.
Yeah. Well, you're putting me on the hot seat here. My boss's boss has spent a lot of time defending the institution and its future and its vision. But it's not, NYPL has taken the position that it cannot sustain the privileges of a research library against the realities of public and private support that care less and less about repositories. And that shows up in the funding particularly from public resources that come from the city of New York. But the funders have asked NYPL to prove its relevance in terms that are less about scholarship and research and preservation and more about sort of broad-based education, community-based impact, which, as you've heard me, I believe strongly in too, but it's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Because as is true, I think, of all of you here, whether you know it or not already, you can't have cultural production, whether it's scholarly or artistic, or literary without sources of inspiration, be they books that last longer than the circulation cycle of your local branch library, or actual some reproduction of material that is either now in digital form or in paper form. And you need that stuff. And there's a tension, a real war around money to pay for what? And people are saying, do we really need to pay this much money to keep a piece of paper in the dark for the next 1,000 years? Does that really make any sense? And those are the questions that are being asked. And it's not just at NYPL, it's at every major institution that has humanities collections. So where does the Schomburg fit in that equation? Well, I am taking the position that you can't reproduce what we have. You can't. And so I have to prove its uniqueness on multiple levels, but I also have to build constituents. And so I need to do both those tasks in order to make the case both internally and externally, to go beyond the system that I exist in and say to other people, you don't realize what the Schomburg has done to shape knowledge in this country in ways that we take for granted, right? This is a kind of Obama argument that got him in a whole bunch of trouble over makers and takers, but I think it's relevant, not in this room, but in that public sphere where you talk to people about how much they depend upon sewage systems and roads and utilities, right, which are all government projects, in order to move commerce, in order to create profit and wealth for folks. Well, the libraries are the same thing. They move ideas from one generation to the next. And so, the richest people in this city pat themselves on the back for being cultural snobs and, very elite and go to all these institutions. Well, that shit wouldn't be there if it weren't for those collecting institutions making an investment. You can't just show up 300 years later or 100 years later, write your big checks, and feel like your name on this building is a big deal when the investments that have been made in those institutions need to continue, right? It's not like this is this unique historical moment where we no longer need to do that, but that's the fight you have to take. So I'm making that fight known as it pertains to the Schomburg collection. And, it's working, but there's a lot of resistance to this kind of soft and squishy stuff. The humanities are not in vogue. I hope that's not depressing.
We know. Why don't you take a moment to have a swig of water?
I'm good with the coffee.
Okay, all right.
More effective.
Hi, my name is Aida. I'm a second-year history student, and I've spent the past year and a half just immersed in the Schomburg Center because I'm actually working on a project on Arturo Schomburg. And the question that I'm about to ask
Make sure you share it with me.
What was that?
Make sure you share it with me and the center when you're done.
The question that I want to ask, actually first I have to say that Professor Gary Wilder from the anthropology department wanted to be here and he graciously allowed me to miss the first half of his class so I could be here, so I just wanted to give shout outs to him because it's all about archival.
It's on the record.
I'm interested in thinking about race and ethnicity, and one of the things that my project kind of delves into is Schomburg as this Black Puerto Rican man and the way in which race or US race has foreclosed the possibility to kind of think of that archive as a Latin American space. So one of the things that happened as I delved into Schomburg's archival practices is that I'm actually looking at him not only being inspired by Harlem, but also by Salvador Brau, Jose Julian Acosta, all of these sort of like Puerto Rican intellectuals. So one of the questions that I have for you in terms of building this constituency is kind of thinking about or using the actual archive as an inspiration to open up a dialogue and why that hasn't happened yet. I mean, I know that, for example, Puerto Ricans, et cetera, Cubans, Latin Americans in general are sort of like scared of the race word, but there's a way in which the very archive is very engaged with Latin American culture, especially in terms of like intellectual politics. So if you could kind of like speak to that and like the possibility for just like cross-pollinations, because one of the things that came to me, for example, is there could be sort of like a conference or something with Centro. Like there could be sort of like a joint conversation about intellectual practices in Latin America from like a Black and a non-Black perspective, so.
Okay, so are you a graduate student or undergraduate?
Graduate student.
Okay, so this is one of these great aha moments as a former professor where you're like, aha, we've already done that, and we'll do more of it. So Miriam Jimenez Roman has been at the Schomburg as a curator, as a scholar in residence for 20 years. She just published an Afro-Latino reader, you may know of it, co-authored by her husband. So internally, I can't account for what hasn't happened over 87 years. What I can say is that people like that who claim that institution as part of their heritage and who are deeply immersed in the legacy of Arturo Schomburg's global vision, both Latino and African, have had no barriers from me in terms of producing knowledge. She hosted a major Afro-Latino conference about a year ago there to bring light to these issues. And we have, I guess, currently, is Nancy still there? Jim, Nancy, what's Nancy's last name? She's doing the work around Cuban and African-American relations. What's that? Yes. So we just had so that's happening at the Schomburg. The problem is, and this is why you're not hearing about it, is because this work happens mostly in the context of academic communities. And so the Schomburg's brand is a public brand and a brand associated with Blackness cultivated over 87 years. But in relation to its scholarly output, it's not obvious to the outside world the things that are happening that reflect exactly what you just described. So that's not to make a defense that we can't do more and do better, but it is to say that the Schomburg is inherently a place that has multiple identities, and it needs the people who use those archives to take ownership of sharing that work. And so Miriam is one of those people who cares deeply about bringing that work to light. There are others like her, but they're not going to get. Now, as the head of that institution, your question couldn't be more timely, and I'll say it for a couple of reasons. One, the National Park Service came to me about 2 weeks ago to ask if we would be interested in designating the Schomburg as a national preservation site. Not because the building is old enough to qualify, which it is not. We have a landmark building that was there from 1905, but that's already a preservation site. But the entire complex. And guess why they want to do it? It's part of their American Latino Heritage Initiative. Because they, at the National Park Service, at the Smithsonian, folks in Congress, you name it, are reading the handwriting on the wall and saying, we better get in front of this Latino machine that is moving and shaking across this country and start to embrace the infrastructure of this country that represents this history and their contributions to this country. So we said, let's do it, and it's in the process of happening. But more even than that, we have this gigantic Dominican population that lives just north of us. East Harlem has always been largely a Puerto Rican community. And in the same way that my institution hasn't been as open to multiple representations of the community, I have a responsibility to figure out ways to invite those communities into that space. And I'm working on it because the truth is, the political demographics of Harlem are changing. I depend on public support and advocates at the very local level to give us capital support. And if the gentleman whose name I forgot, just bad with names, who might have beaten Charlie Rangel, and Charlie Rangel has been very generous to Schomburg, but what's his name? He ran against Charlie Rangel in the last congressional. Y'all had to get out more. But if he had won, right, then not only would I be recalling my Spanish which I've not spoken with any fluency since I dated a Guatemalan woman in my early 20s. But I would be, trying to cultivate, and I need to do it anyway. It's not just the political realities. It needs to happen. I think personally that the institution's name probably will limit its ability down the road. And I've not figured out how to deal with that, because it would be very difficult for me to, in 18 months, to say, let's change the name of the Schomburg from one that is black culture in a very, that means something in a very specific way. But those are the challenges. I appreciate the heads up to focus on them and to figure it out.
I mean, I'm very familiar with Medium's work, but again, the issue there is Afro-Latino, right? That's primarily what she works on. I'm actually, part of what I'm putting on the table is actually reaching out to white Latin Americans or non-Black, because in the archive itself, there's a way in which to dialogue with them. Like a lot of things that pertain to non-Afro culture, at least in Latin America, from the work that I do, is very much within the Schomburg realm.
So Bill, you asked me about partnerships. Yeah. You need to give her a little bit of a research stipend to come to the Schomburg and I'm not even joking, be a development consultant.
Wait a minute. There's a long line for those research stipends. Hello. Let's just clear that up.
Right now, she's at the top
pressure's
of.
on.
She's jumped the line.
She is at the top of the
That
list
sounded like
because
a yes, so come talk to me after.
because this is precisely my point. You know that. I'm never gonna know that. There's not enough hours in the day for me to know what stories can be told across multiple platforms out of the archives. And so if people don't share those stories, don't share that insight, if they're not on board with thinking, how do I help make this relevant to multiple communities who can then help the Schomburg or help change the world and be more, whatever the case may be, then it doesn't happen. And so, I need your help in that way. I need you to tell me those stories, because I am sitting down with very wealthy patrons of Latin American art right now.
Campeche. I mean, I learned about him through the archive.
Yep. So I listen, this summer, I'm going to be sitting down with some of those folks again. And if I could say, hey, listen, did you know that these are these intersecting currents? It totally changes my currency in those conversations.
We have time for one quick question, with the emphasis on quick and one.
I'll see you again.
Hi, I'm Marion Parker. I'm a master's student here. I'm actually very interested in hearing about some of the things that you're doing to reach out in the communities, particularly in public schools. Because not only, my personal interest in that is that I am also a music teacher at Case 129, not very far from you, actually. And I've been thinking for a long time, well, how can I take my music students into Schomburg? How can I get them involved and be aware of this wonderful institution as a resource? And I guess, sorry, that's more than enough.
That's good.
I'm also interested in how can you, there's this wonderful media collection.
Yeah.
And how can you use that also?
You guys have great. This is awesome. So, I mean that sincerely. So, when I talked about resources and curators, so the curator of that division retired, it sort of was offered retirement in 2009 when the economy was terrible and the library was slashing budgets, and we've not replaced him. So the AV collection at the Schomburg, which is incredibly rich, has been dormant for a long time. So, I just got money. If you go to NYPO right now, there's a job posting. So if you know an experienced person who can run a division like that, please encourage them to apply. So that's good news. And that means we can be more responsive to these kinds of needs, because one of our strengths in that collection is music.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two, I'm glad you asked the question about K through 12, because, and this is where my interests with Tony Marks are in alignment. I do believe that the New York Public Library system across all levels can do a lot more to infuse a sense of knowledge and inspiration into our K through 12 system that is really under-resourced and under-inspired about the humanities in general. And so we have a program we've had in place for a long time, but we are absolutely committed to getting as many kids in that building for special events, for sustained touches, for creative ways in which they get to learn the archive. The challenge there, on one hand, we're already doing it. So if you want to get your students there, it's really just a phone call. You might have to be a little persistent, or you can write to me and I can forward your request to the right person, and it just gets scheduled. That's easily done. And we can do it every year or if twice a year. That happens. That's not a problem. But the bigger scale issue requires resources and commitment. And I am fundraising for that as we speak, because I do feel like there's so much that we can offer our middle school and high school students on this score. We are building a children's gallery that will open in probably 2015. So it'll be a place that is dedicated in the building for them to come and engage collections and have a safe space to learn and do whatever. And I'm very excited about that. So.
On that note, I'd just like to say again that it's so wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Robert.
I hope you'll be here often. And I really do hope, I think I speak for everyone in the room when I say that we certainly should have great and an intimate connection between the Graduate Center and the Schomburg, and there should be a lot of movement between 131st Street and, well, I guess 34th Street and I was going to say, and Fifth Avenue. You get it. Sorry, don't make me, I'm doing the numbers now. You'll all join me in thanking Khalil Muhammad.
Copies of our newsletter. They're not enough for everyone, which is why I didn't pass them around. But if you're so inclined, I do not want to carry these back home on New Jersey Transit. So they're here. And there's flyers for order. See, I'm doing what I said I'd do, which is I'm trying to get you there. So don't let me down. And also part of owning these kinds of institutions is supporting them. So the Schomburg Center has a Friends Society. You can join the Friends Society for $35 annually. It's a fairly inexpensive way to be on our rolls. It helps me make a case for why we're so important. So I brought some flyers. And then schomburg.org is our website. So it's where you can go to learn more about current programming. And we do some amazing stuff. Just, fun programming. So don't just look to see what's happening at CUNY or NYU or wherever else you may do your normal searching for programs, and come to the conversation series. And for those of you who do teach at the undergraduate level or even in K through 12, we have something called Digital Schomburg, and we've curated a series of exhibitions that are world class, and I say that with as much boastfulness as is implied, because they are visited from folks all over the world. They're the leading exhibitions on New York Public Library's website and have been that way for a long time. They're global in reach. We've looked at Africans in India. We've looked at diasporic migration movements. So you can find Digital Schomburg as one of the links at schomburg.org. But you can share this with your students in the classroom and bring the collections into that space as well. So thank you.
There's a reception, and it's right next door.
These are, I brought these if you want it. Africans in India. It's a panel exhibition now. And Visualizing Emancipation closes on March 16th. Really terrific show. So if you have time this end of this week or by Saturday, come check it out. It's been reviewed widely. It's a very special show. So I'll leave all this stuff up here and you can take a look at it.
Thank you. Thank you.